I wanted to share with you, probably you know all about it already. When the US Constitution was proposed, Benjamin Franklin was saying that it looks very promising. However, there's two things that are certain in life, and that's death and taxes. So from the taxes that we heard all about it right now, we're going to move on to another promising regulation and law that is coming up, and that is the MiCA. We're going to be hearing a bit more about the challenges and the promises, the opportunities that MiCA represents. And we're going to be inviting to the stage Faustine Fleuret, come on, Gunnar Ólafsson, and Alex Tompkins. Thank you so much.
Do we turn it on? Do we turn it on, like the microphones?
Which one?
Are they on?
I don't.
Under the microphones, are they on? Are they on? Are they on? Yeah? Okay, great. Awesome. Oh, wow. Yeah, it is on. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. The panel that we have today is about MiCA and the problems with its implementation. And I'm joined today by my fellow panelists, Faustine Fleuret. She's the president and CEO of ADAN, which is the professional body representing crypto companies in France and also in the EU or abroad. And then we also have Gunnar Ólafsson, and he's the counsel in Monerium. So we're going to talk about something that's been in the news for the past 2 years almost, and that is the markets and crypto asset regulation, so MiCA. And it was envisioned, or it was basically part of the EU strategy or digital finance strategy. And it was envisioned to kind of tackle a series of market developments, such as, for example, the growth of Bitcoin, but it was also envisioned to tackle the increasing number of ICOs or even other potential problems that have arisen in the scams, hacks, etc. So with that in mind, the objectives of MiCA are quite clear: consumer protection, investor protection, financial stability, but also monetary sovereignty. And it is especially this point that is featured extensively in the latter stages of the negotiations. So with that in mind, Faustine, can you please give us a quick recap of what MiCA is, what kind of animal is it, and also what are the opportunities that it brings to market participants?
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. So MiCA is actually a long process because the text was adopted a few weeks ago, but actually the process of designing MiCA comes from the work of the European Commission in 2019, starting with a public consultation of the industry. Then you had the first draft of the text, the first proposal of the Commission in September 2020, where we could provide new comments, and then the other EU institutions, so the Council and the Parliament, could work on this and propose their own versions of MiCA. Leading to trilogue, they had to find a compromise, and that's what we had finally in June under the French presidency of the EU Council, a political deal of what is MiCA, and as you said, how we can reach the objectives of MiCA thanks to accurate provision. So we have this political deal right now, and since July, the EU institutions were working also on how to translate into technical details this political deal. So there was this text adopted a few weeks ago, but it's not really the final one because there will still be some work to do within the EU before we have the entry into force of this text. So a really long process for nearly 3 years, but that is a really positive process. Why? Because before MiCA, there was a fragmentation of regulations across member states, and that's really detrimental to the growth of businesses because of the legal uncertainty and the fact that you don't have the same rules and then the same chances, I would say, for businesses. So what could bring MiCA is first passporting, because now if you are registering with your national competent authority as a crypto asset service provider or an issuer, you will be able to provide your services or to issue your crypto assets in the whole EU area without requiring other authorization from other authorities. So That's a great simplification for regulated companies. And finally, it's easier for them to expand their business to the EU. It provides legal certainty because now every actor in the EU targeting the EU public will know what they will have to comply with if they want to provide their services or issue their assets in the EU. And finally, you restore level playing field. At one point in other member states, you had national regulations, which were stricter or less strict than others. So for companies, and especially in France, where we have a regulation for more than 3 years, it was really hard to see what was the opportunity to be regulated before. And so now everyone will have to comply with the same rules. It will be really easier for them to expand and to see the benefit of regulation. So MiCA is an opportunity, even if it's not perfect.
Exactly. Very well said. John, I wanted to ask you about one of the most debated issues, I would say, throughout the MiCA negotiations, and this is the limitation or the cap on stablecoins that are used as a means of exchange, so basically for payment purposes. At one point, there was, this is especially the case for those that are pegged to foreign currencies, but at one point, the industry was very fearful that this could cause a liquidity crunch for EU crypto market. So what are your views on this, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you see this particular issue?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's important to maybe take one step back and explain what MiCA's purposes is with regards to stablecoins. So MiCA really defines two types of stablecoins. So there are e-money tokens and then asset reference tokens. And as many have talked about lately, and when MiCA was published the first time, the drafts, asset reference tokens and that definition, it kind of mimic the Facebook's Libra coin. So it was kind of obvious that this was the response of the union to, counter Facebook's project. But then what MiCA does also is to commingle a framework for e-money institutions that have been, existing in the Eurozone for 20 years. And so the company I work for, Monerium, we are an e-money institution and we issue e-money on blockchains. And back in 2019, when we were getting our license in Iceland, nobody knew what e-money was and nobody knew what blockchains was in Iceland. So now everybody knows what blockchain is, but nobody knows what e-money is. So it has kind of a flipped. But e-money, it's basically an electronic circuit for cash and notes, so it's electronic cash, right? And companies like PayPal and Revolut have operated under this regime in Europe for quite some time. And what MiCA does, and the principles of MiCA, they kind of enforce issuers of these e-money tokens to become e-money institutions or credit institutions. But the principles of MiCA and the principle of legislating financial industry is they say in the recitals, it should be the same activity, same risks, same rules, right? But with regards to e-money tokens, that's not the case because MiCA put forth more stringent requirements to e-money token issuers than traditional e-money issuers. There's a lot of e-money issuers in the Eurozone, providing services that are not related to blockchain, but e-money is certainly a thing in Europe. But most of these neobanks operate under this regime. But with regards to e-money tokens, there are put further requirements that are not related to the technology that's being used. It's like back office, although really important measures with regards to how we safeguard the client's funds. So e-money institutions, they're allowed to, when they receive the funds from the customer, then issue the e-money. They're allowed to invest it in secure high liquid assets, which are basically governmental bonds, or they're able to place it on a segregated account. What MiCA does, it puts forth a limit, so each e-money token issuer has to have 30% at all time in a bank account of the segregated funds. And that, reduces the capabilities because e-money issuers, their business model is they're not allowed to pay interest, so they can keep the capital gains on the asset reserve. And this has nothing to do, these requirements or extra requirements have nothing to do with, blockchains or DLT. Like this is the same risk and same problem for, either if I'm using a blockchain network or a proprietary database, right? Then another thing that is done in this, in MiCA is that you're not allowed to take currency risks. So like when you invest in assets, they have to be denominated in the same currency that you issue. So like the Eurozone, it has changed now, but for the last 15 years, we've been dealing with negative interest rates, and that's the business model of the e-money institution. So you're kind of paying with the operation, and it's obvious that that kind of a business model doesn't work out. And then there are some other good things that I at least find. There are some requirements to have a redemption plan in place. That's when you go under stress and you need to wind down or you need to liquidate assets. And I think that is a really good mechanism to have in place. But this is not a typical or like a blockchain-related risk, right? Every other e-money institution has this kind of a problem and could face those problems we saw with Wirecard, right? And then like the UK has actually countered this, and there's a special regime or like regulation in place in the UK where there's some insolvency procedures for e-money institutions in order to, get the customers their funds back as quickly as possible and at a reduced cost. But then there are some, as you mentioned, so I'm like coming back to the question right now, sorry for the long dialogue, with regards to the, so there's this like glass ceiling with regards to e-money tokens that are issued in another currency, not in euro or a currency like within the Eurozone, right? So for example, US dollars. I'm not that sure if it will, affect the industry as a whole with regards to the e-money issuers, but like I understand where the regulators are coming from, because like they are afraid of a dollarization, and like with regards to asset reference tokens, you can argue that the issuers of asset reference tokens, they are actually increasing the money supply, because when you take on assets and you convert it into some sort of a thing that is supposed to be a money, you're actually increasing the volume of money in the ecosystem, which has been like predominantly the role of the banks when they, provide loans, and the roles of the central bank when they, do quantitative easing.
Exactly.
So yeah, I understand like where they're coming from and what risk they're trying to mitigate, but I don't think it's only relevant to like e-money tokens that are issued on blockchain, because like as a traditional e-money institution, you can issue e-money in dollars, in Swiss franc. It doesn't matter. You can just like, if you're able to support it, you are able to do it.
Great. I think that here there's also the issue of promoting the international role of the euro. So that's why euro EMTs are not capped, but rather those pegged to a foreign currency. Faustine, I also wanted to take your views while we're on the topic on algo stablecoins, and basically how has that ended up in the final text? What are your views on that?
So there had been a very pragmatic approach of the EU about some innovations like DeFi. So we were really happy to get that in the final MiCA text, DeFi is exempted, because MiCA is not designed for regulating smart contract protocols. MiCA is a regulation for intermediaries, for providers. So there will be long-term work by the EU in terms of defining what could be the appropriate rules for decentralized finance. The problem is that EU doesn't believe in the existence of decentralized stablecoins right now. And that's really obvious when you hear central banks recently speaking about stablecoins. They speak about so-called stablecoins, so-called decentralized stablecoins. And in the final text, in the final MiCA text, algorithmic stablecoins, decentralized stablecoin will be included into the MiCA scope. So it goes against the pragmatic approach of DeFi exemption. So algorithmic stablecoins will need to be finally re-centralized, re-intermediated, because in order to comply, for issuers to comply with MiCA. So it's really a pity, because the EU understood why DeFi and decentralized innovation had to be treated differently. But finally, regarding stablecoins, they decided not to have this pragmatic approach. And it's really important in terms of monetary sovereignty and digital sovereignty of the EU as a whole that we have euro stablecoins, and you have some very interesting projects in the EU which are decentralized stablecoins. So we are really afraid that it attempts to this monetary sovereignty if at the end we don't expand, I would say, the DeFi exemption that is set in MiCA.
Very good, very good. Faustine, I also wanted to take your views on basically the sustainability debate that has been ongoing throughout MiCA negotiations. At one point, there was even some, people at EU level, politicians, policymakers, that were advocating for the ban of proof of work or a ban of Bitcoin. Can you tell us a little bit about how this debate evolved and how it has been settled in MiCA?
Yes, in the very initial version of MiCA, there was nothing about the environmental treatment of crypto assets. But there is a growing preconceived ideas that circulated saying that crypto assets were environmental disasters. And finally, the EU had a look on this topic, and that's why the first idea that they had was to ban proof of work. Barely, meaning it was more complicated. It was asking crypto asset service providers and issuers not to issue cryptos or not to provide services on protocols that would be energy intensive. And when you had a look in the MiCA, it was barely proof of work or proof of work protocols. So finally, in the debates, the EU also understood that it was not a really simple debate. So that crypto assets are not a catastrophe for environment, that they were very different functioning, and so that the question had to be treated more pragmatically. So in the final MiCA version, there are rules, so very informational requirements for issuers and for providers on the environmental impact of their issuances on the services that they provide. So that's really the best approach that we could have, and that's normal, that's logical that this information is disclosed to EU citizens. But there will be a long-term work by the Commission to maybe add some other provisions on this environmental topic in maybe a MiCA 2, a new version of MiCA. So the work is not over on this question. And recently we had the EU action plan for the digitalization of the energy sector, where the mining sector was addressed. And the idea is maybe to prevent miners or to ask them to stop their activity when there is an energy crunch. That's also maybe understandable in the current context, but so we have to take care of what's coming in the debate, because there will be new provisions to be added soon.
Very good, very well said. John, very quickly, coming from an EFTA country, non-EU, not strictly EU, I wanted to take your views on how you see MiCA impacting the competitiveness of the EU with respect to other jurisdictions. And do you think that MiCA can be used as a sort of standard across the world?
Yeah, it's an interesting framing of the word standard, because we have always said that the e-money directive could be the best standard for tokenized fiat currencies on chain, and we are we think it's an absolutely fantastic legal framework. But with MiCA and how that could work, I think the word, what I've been hearing in the industry is many, for example, US-based lawyers are quite envious of this framework, because at least what you get is clarity. You get some sort of a certainty, and that's really needed to, increase the trust in this industry. And instead of always saying, no, this is security and you can't get any explanations out of the SEC, you don't know what you're doing, here you have it. Obviously it's not perfect, but at least there's some clarity around, at least centralized actors in the space. And yeah, it could definitely, for maybe smaller jurisdictions, I don't think US will maybe adopt it completely, but for smaller jurisdictions, I think this, in order to harmonize as well as against the EU and open up your market to that, it could be a good standard. But I'm just really happy that this is a regulation, so like it will be implemented really quickly in Iceland, but like with directives that could then sometimes takes up to 5 years, so you kind of miss the opportunity to
Exactly.
to comply. So yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much. And I know that we're basically reaching the end of our time, but very quickly, Faustine, maybe you can give us a bit of a glimpse of what's left to do regarding MiCA, because I think that there's some sort of practical work to operationalize the regulation. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So the MiCA regulation is not one single text. So we are waiting for this final level 1 text to be published, so maybe at the end of the year or the beginning of next year. And it will be published then in the official journal of the EU. And there will be, so the delay before the implementation of MiCA that will start, so around 12 or 18 months, depending on the provisions. So that's for the level 1 implementation, I would say. But at the same time, waiting for the implementation of MiCA, there will be technical work to be done because, as I said, MiCA is not one single text, so there will be level 2 text, level 2 standards, and probably level 3 standards, also to give the accurate technical clarifications for the actors to be able to know how to comply with MiCA and to have all the relevant information. So there will be more technical, those texts will be more technical than MiCA. So it will last for the next months, maybe for some years before we have those texts. So we will have, as industry players, to help this work to design those standards. And what we can see is that, so it will be a work by the EU institutions and regulators, but some countries like France, but also some international bodies like IOSCO, the Financial Stability Board, are already looking at questions to be solved in those standards. So for example, in France, we are expecting a report by the government in November, so this month, about the environmental impact of crypto assets. So they will probably feed the debates at the EU level of what could be those new rules that I was talking about in terms of environmental treatment of crypto assets. France and IOSCO, for example, are already working on what could be the basic principles of the regulation of decentralized finance. So even if it's a really long process and that we will have a final MiCA in, like, let's say 2 years, the work is right now. So it's really important that crypto stakeholders in industry be part of those debates at the level of their country, but at the EU level also, and if they can, in the international working groups, because we are currently designing the regulation that will apply to them, and it's really important that they are able to give their expertise, their experience of how the markets work, what could be an appropriate and a proportionate regulation, because otherwise it will be too late if we are waiting for those 2 years.
Great, that's perfectly summed up. I think the main takeaway here is MiCA is just the beginning. There's a lot of work still to be done, both at EU level, but also at international level. Thank you very much, and a big round of applause for the panelists.